The morning Harriet Brooks rode into Caldwell, Kansas, with $43 and a prayer folded inside her coat pocket. The sun was cutting hard and low across the flatlands, turning the dust on Main Street to something that looked almost like gold, which was cruel, she thought, given that gold was precisely what she did not have. It was the spring of 1882, and Caldwell sat just north of the Cherokee Strip like a town that had not quite decided whether it wanted to be civilized or not. The cattle drives still pushed through from the south, and the saloons still outnumbered the churches 3-1, and the wind off the grassland still carried that particular smell of livestock and open sky, and something else underneath it all that Harriet had always privately believed was the scent of possibility, though the last 2 years had done considerable work to erode that belief. She had come a long way. She had come from Wichita, where she had been working as a seamstress and a laundress, and occasionally a cook for a boarding house on Douglas Avenue, saving every cent she could lay her hands on, denying herself things that other women her age took for granted: new ribbon for a Sunday hat, a piece of hard candy from the general store, a half-hour at the bathhouse when the week had ground her down to her last nerve. She was 26 years old, and she had not bought herself anything pretty in 14 months, and she did not intend to until she had done what she had come to Caldwell to do. Her father's land lay 8 miles east of town, along a creek called Willow Run that fed into the Arkansas River. 60 acres of bottom land and rolling pasture that Elijah Brooks had claimed in 1873 and worked for 9 years with his hands and his back and eventually with his dying breath, which had come 2 winters ago on a Wednesday morning in February, when the cold and the debt and a bad chest had all arrived at the same time and taken him before Harriet could get from Wichita to his side. The debt had taken the land. That was the simple version of the story. The longer version involved a man named Gerald Purvis, who ran a lending operation out of a back office on Commerce Street and charged interest rates that would have made a riverboat gambler blush, and a drought year in 1880 that had turned the creek to a trickle and the pasture to powder, and her father's stubborn refusal to ask for help until it was far too late for help to arrive in any useful form. Purvis had taken the deed, and then Purvis had sold the land. And that was the part of the story that had kept Harriet lying awake in her narrow bed at the Wichita boarding house, staring at the ceiling while the wind moved the curtain, because she had been saving to buy the land back from Purvis, and then Purvis had gone and sold it to someone else entirely before she could get enough money together. She had written a letter to the county land office in Caldwell. They had written back to tell her the land had been purchased by a man named Stephen Reed, who ran a cattle operation east of town and who had also recently acquired the old Dunmore place to the north. They had helpfully included the deed transfer date, which was 3 weeks before her letter had arrived, and they had offered their sincere regrets, which she had read twice and then set down very carefully on the kitchen table, and then walked outside and stood in the yard for a long time looking at nothing in particular. She had written to Stephen Reed directly. The letter had been polite but clear. She had explained that the land in question had been her father's, that she intended to purchase it back, and that she would appreciate knowing his price. Stephen Reed had not written back, so she had saved for 4 more months, and now she had $43. And she had ridden 3 days to come and speak to the man directly, because, in Harriet's experience, the things that mattered most in this world required you to show up in person and refuse to be comfortable about it. She tied her horse at the rail outside the land office first, because she wanted to confirm the address she had been given for Reed's cattle operation, and also because she wanted a moment to compose herself before riding out to confront a man who had not bothered to answer her letter. The land agent was a small, fussy man named Corwin who wore his collar too tight and kept his files in an order that appeared to be meaningful only to himself. He found the information she needed after considerable rustling and muttering and a short detour through someone else's deed entirely, and he gave her directions to the Reed cattle operation with the cautious expression of a man who was not sure he was doing the right thing. "Mr. Reed is a fair man," Corwin offered as she was turning to leave. "Decent. Not the sort to be difficult if that's your concern." "I have no concerns," Harriet said pleasantly, which was not entirely true, but she had found over the years that announcing your concerns to strangers generally did not improve your position. She rode east out of Caldwell on the road that Corwin had described, past the cattle pens where the smell was something you accepted rather than enjoyed, and then out into the open country where the grassland went wide and the sky went wider, and the wind was doing its constant Kansas work of reminding you how small you were. Wildflowers were coming up along the roadside bluebonnets, and something yellow she did not know the name of, and the creek she could see occasionally through the cottonwood trees to her right was running clear and full with the spring melt, which struck her as almost unbearable given that it had been a dry trickle when her father needed it most. The Reed place announced itself with a gate made of good pine posts and a sign that was simple and well-made, just the name burned into the wood, Reed Cattle Co. The lane beyond it was rutted with wagon tracks and lined on both sides with a split-rail fence that someone had put up with care, the posts all plumb and the rails all even. It was the kind of fence a person built when they intended to stay. The house came into view around a bend in the lane, and Harriet pulled her horse to a slow walk because she needed a moment to adjust to what she was seeing. She had assembled an image of Stephen Reed in her mind during the ride out from town, a heavy-set older man, comfortable in his success, perhaps a little red-faced, the sort of man who bought up other people's land without giving much thought to what that land had meant to the people who had worked it, and the image had served the purpose of keeping her anger at a useful temperature during the 3 days of riding. The man she saw coming out of the barn was not that image. He was young. She revised that almost immediately to not old, which was more accurate, because he moved like a man who had worked hard long enough to have left youth behind him. And he was tall in the way that some men in this country were tall, the kind of tall that came from a long line of people who had done physical work in open spaces. He had dark hair that the wind was doing something with, and his shirt was rolled to the elbows and stained with the honest grime of morning chores, and he walked across the yard with the loose, unhurried stride of a man on his own property who did not yet know he was being watched. He saw her when she came through the gate, and he stopped, and he tilted his head slightly in the way a person does when they are trying to make sense of something unexpected. Harriet kept her horse at a steady walk and stopped at a respectful distance and looked down at him from the saddle, which she was aware gave her a temporary height advantage she intended to use. "I am looking for Stephen Reed," she said. "You found him," he said. His voice was low and even, and he was looking at her with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite curiosity, but something in between. "My name is Harriet Brooks," she said. "I wrote you a letter." Something moved across his face then, not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it, a kind of recognition that carried a weight she had not expected to see there. He took off his hat and held it at his side. "Miss Brooks," he said, "you did write me a letter. You did not write back." "No," he said, "I did not." There was a pause. The wind moved through the cottonwood trees along the fence line and made a sound like distant water. "I would appreciate knowing why," she said. He looked at her for a moment, steady and direct, not rude but not apologetic either, and then he said, "Because I did not know what to say to you. I still don't, if I'm being honest. But I expect you'd better come down off that horse, and we can talk about it properly." It was not the response she had prepared for. She had prepared for defensiveness, or dismissal, or the kind of cheerful unconcern that men with land and money often showed toward women who wanted something from them. She had not prepared for honesty, and it threw her off her stride just enough that she dismounted without saying anything further, and tied her horse to the fence post he indicated with a nod of his head. He led her to the porch, and she sat in one of the 2 chairs there, and he remained standing, leaning against the post with his hat still in his hand, and he said, "Tell me what you want." "I want to buy back my father's land," she said. "The 60 acres along Willow Run. I know you paid more than I have to offer. I have $43. She said it plainly without apology because she had decided on the road that she would not be embarrassed by the smallness of the sum. It was what she had, and she had worked honestly for it. "I am prepared to make payments on the remainder if you will give me a price and a time." He was quiet for a moment. A horse shifted in the barn behind them, and somewhere in the yard a chicken made a remark about something. "What would you do with it?" he asked. The question surprised her. "I beg your pardon. The land," he said. "What would you do with it if you had it back?" She looked at him carefully, trying to read his intention. "Work it," she said. "My father built a house there. It's still standing as far as I know. I would live in it and work the land. I know how." "The house is standing," he said. "I've had a man keep the roof and the windows." He paused. "I've had someone tend the kitchen garden too since early April." She stared at him. "Why?" He looked down at his hat for a moment, turning the brim in his hands. "Because it seemed like the right thing to do," he said quietly. "Miss Brooks, I bought that land from Gerald Purvis 6 months ago. I bought it because it was good bottom land and it was priced well, and I needed the pasture. I didn't know when I bought it about the circumstances of how Purvis came to have it." He looked back up at her, and his eyes were a dark shade of brown that she had not noticed from the saddle, and they were entirely serious. "I found out afterward, from a man in town who knew your father. He told me about the drought year and the loan and the interest rates Purvis charged. And I'll tell you plainly, Miss Brooks, I did not feel good about what I had done, even though I had done it honestly and in good faith." The wind pushed at the edge of her hat brim, and she reached up to steady it without looking away from him. "And yet you didn't write back," she said. "No," he said, "because I didn't know what to offer you, and I didn't want to offer you the wrong thing." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about it since your letter came, thinking about it a fair amount, to be truthful." Harriet folded her hands in her lap and looked out at the land that spread east from his house, the good Kansas grassland going gold and green in the spring light. And she thought about her father and the way he had always stood on the porch of that house in the evening, and looked out at the creek, and said that a man could ask for a great deal in this life, and none of it would matter much if he had a piece of ground he could call his own. "Then I will tell you what I want to offer," she said, turning back to Stephen Reed. $43 now, and I will work. I will take in laundry, I will sew, I will do whatever work comes available in Caldwell. And I will pay you a set amount each month until the debt is settled, at whatever interest rate you name, as long as it is fair." He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she began to feel the edges of her composure working slightly, though she kept her face still and her hands quiet in her lap. Then he said, "Miss Brooks, I am going to do something that will probably strike you as odd." "I am prepared for odd," she said. The corner of his mouth moved in what might have been a smile, though it came and went before she could be certain. He stepped off the porch and walked to the fence where her horse was tied, and she turned in her chair to watch him, thoroughly confused. He stood there for a moment looking at the eastern pasture, the Willow Run pasture, and then he walked back to the porch and stood in front of her with his hat still in his hands. "I will sell you that land," he said. "The 60 acres along Willow Run, the house, the garden, and whatever equipment is in the outbuildings. I will sell it to you for $1. She thought she had misheard him. "I'm sorry, $1, he said again. "American, that's my price." She stood up from the chair, which put her closer to him than she had intended, and she looked up at him with an expression she could not entirely control. "That is not a fair price," she said. "That land is worth considerably more than $1, and you know it, and I know it, and I will not take charity, Mr. Reed. I came here to make a fair offer and to do this properly." "It is not charity," he said, and his voice was very steady and very quiet. "It is what I think is right. The land was taken from your father by a man who charged unconscionable interest rates on a loan he knew a man in a drought year could not repay. I bought it in good faith, but I benefited from that injustice whether I intended to or not. I am not willing to profit from it further." He paused. $1, Miss Brooks, and I want nothing else from you for it." The quality of the silence that followed was something Harriet had never encountered before. She had been prepared for negotiation. She had been prepared for rejection. She had been prepared to argue and to persist and to ride back to Caldwell and come back again tomorrow if that was what it took. She had not been prepared for this. "That is the most unusual business arrangement I have ever heard of," she said at last. "It is not a business arrangement," he said. "It is me attempting to correct something that should not have happened in the first place." She looked at him. He looked at her. The wind moved between them and carried with it the smell of the spring grass and the creek water and the faint distant sweetness of the wildflowers along the road. $1, she said. $1. She reached into her coat pocket and produced her small purse and opened it and took out a single silver dollar and held it out to him. He took it from her hand, and she was aware in the moment that their fingers did not touch, though they came close. He looked at the coin for a moment with an expression she could not name, and then he looked up at her. "Your name," he said. "I know you said it, but I want to hear it again properly. What is your name?" She was momentarily startled. "Harriet Brooks," she said. "My father was Elijah Brooks." "Harriet," he said, as though he was testing the sound of it, and there was something in the way he said it that was quiet and careful and entirely different from the way anyone else had said her name in a very long time. "It suits you." She did not know what to say to that, and she had the unusual experience, for a woman who generally knew exactly what to say, of saying nothing at all. He went inside the house then to get paper and a pen, and he wrote out the deed of sale in his own hand. Simple and clear, 60 acres along Willow Run for $1 received in full, with the date and his signature. And he handed it to her and asked her to sign beneath. And she did. And then he folded the original and said she should take it to Corwin at the land office to have it properly recorded. He gave her a copy as well. She stood there on his porch with the deed in her hands and her father's land restored to her name, and she had a feeling she did not know what to do with, which was that the world was occasionally a stranger and more generous place than she had allowed herself to believe. "Thank you," she said. "I do not know how to thank you adequately." "No thanks required," he said. "But Miss Brooks," he paused, and she had the sense that he was choosing his next words with some care. "The land has been looked after, but the house will need some work before it is comfortable for winter. The north window has a cracked pane and the chimney wants pointing. I would not want you to move in and find it unprepared." "I can manage repairs," she said. "I'm sure you can," he said. "I was not suggesting otherwise." He looked at her steadily. "But if you needed any assistance with the heavier work, I am not far. 8 miles is not far." She held his gaze for a moment. 8 miles is not far," she agreed. And then she picked up her reins and mounted her horse and rode back down the lane toward the road. And she did not look back, though she was aware with an awareness that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with something considerably more complicated, that he watched her go. She spent 3 days in Caldwell getting the deed recorded and buying supplies at the general store. Flour and salt and cornmeal and coffee, and a pair of good candles, and a length of oilcloth and some wire, and a new hinge for a gate she had not yet seen but suspected would need one. She stayed at the hotel on Main Street, which was modest but clean, and she ate her supper in the dining room alone and watched the town do its evening business through the window. Caldwell in the spring of 1882 was a particular kind of alive. The cattle season was just beginning, and the drovers came up from Texas along the Kishom Trail with their herds and their dust and their thirst, and the town accommodated all of this with a cheerful pragmatism that Harriet found interesting to observe. There was a roughness to the place, certainly. The saloons did not close until very late and sometimes not at all, and there were disputes settled in the street with a volume that rattled the hotel windows. But there was also a genuine bustle to it, a sense of commerce and momentum, And she liked the way the women of the town moved through it all with the kind of competent purposefulness that came from living in a place that demanded competence as a matter of daily survival. She went out to the Brooks place. She was already calling it that again in her mind, refusing to call it the Reed property even for the brief time it had technically been his on the fourth morning, with her supplies loaded in the panniers of a rented pack horse, and her heart doing something complicated that she chose to attribute to the significance of the occasion and nothing else whatsoever. The house was exactly as she remembered it, and it was also different in the way that things are different when time has changed you rather than them. The cottonwood trees along the creek were taller. The kitchen garden had been turned and planted with early vegetables, onions and kale, and some small green things she could not identify from the lane, though she thought they might be peas. Someone had done this work carefully. The thought of Stephen Reed arranging for that care made something in her chest do a small, inconvenient thing that she firmly set aside. She spent a week cleaning and settling. The crack in the north window she patched with putty she mixed herself, having found a small tin of linseed oil in the outbuilding, and a bag of whiting that her father had never used. The chimney she could not manage alone, but it would hold until fall and she had time. She planted more in the kitchen garden, tomatoes and squash and beans, and she walked the 60 acres in the long spring evenings, going slow along the creek bank and through the eastern pasture, and up the slight rise on the northern end where the grass was thicker and taller, and the view of the surrounding country was wide and good. Her father had walked this land every evening. She could feel him in it. She did not cry often, as a general rule, but on the third evening she sat on the porch in the failing light and cried for him, properly and without embarrassment, because there was no one to see it, and because he deserved it, and because the land deserved to know that someone had come back for it and had not stopped thinking about it. On the 9th day, she heard a horse on the lane and came to the door to find Stephen Reed riding toward her at an easy canter, and she observed with the detached interest of a person noting a fact about the weather that he sat a horse well. He pulled up at the fence and touched his hat brim and said, "Morning. I was riding this way and thought I would see how you were settling." "Very well," she said from the doorway. "Would you like coffee?" The question came out before she had fully decided to ask it, which was not like her, and she watched him process the invitation with a kind of careful pleasure that he did not entirely manage to keep off his face. "I would appreciate that," he said. She made coffee on the wood stove that had been her father's, using the good tin pot she had brought from Wichita, and he sat at the kitchen table with his hat on his knee and looked around the room with the attentive politeness of a man who understood he was in someone else's space. "You've made it comfortable," he said, quickly. "I know how to work," she said, pouring 2 cups and sitting across from him. "I know you do," he said. "I can see it." There was a quality to the morning in the kitchen that was very particular, the light coming through the east window, the smell of coffee and wood smoke, the sound of the creek just audible through the open door, and it made conversation feel less like an obligation and more like a natural thing, which was perhaps why she found herself talking to him more easily than she had expected. She told him about Wichita and the boarding house and the work she had done there. He told her about how he had come to Kansas in 1876, which was the year she was still in school in Missouri, and how he had worked cattle for 3 years before buying his first piece of ground. She told him about her father and the way he had talked about the land, and Stephen Reed listened to this with a stillness and attention that she found remarkable in a man, because, in her experience, men's attention tended to wander during the parts of a conversation that mattered most. He stayed for an hour. When he stood to leave, he knocked his chair back slightly and caught it before it fell, and she saw in that small moment of clumsiness a crack in the composed and self-possessed surface he presented, and she liked him considerably better for it. At the door he paused and turned and said, "There is a social at the Caldwell Grange Hall on Saturday evening. Music and supper. Most of the neighboring people will be there. It might be useful for you to meet your neighbors." She looked at him. "Are you inviting me to a Grange social, Mr. Reed?" He had the grace to look very slightly uncertain, which on a tall, calm, dark-haired man had an effect that she noted and then very deliberately did not think further about. "I am suggesting it might be worth your time," he said. "The community here is a good one." "I will think about it," she said. She went. She told herself she was going because it made good practical sense to meet the people who lived nearby, which was entirely true and not the whole truth. She drove the wagon she had borrowed from the livery in Caldwell. She had not yet been able to afford a horse of her own, which was a problem she was working on, and she wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool with a white collar, and she pinned her hair up neatly and added a small ivory brooch that had been her mother's, and decided that this was sufficient. The Grange Hall was full of lantern light and fiddle music, and the smell of good food, and people turned to look at her when she came in with the particular interested attention of a community that was close-knit enough to notice a new face. She was introduced to the Hartley family, who farmed to the north of her, and a woman named Martha Oakes who ran the millinery shop in town, and who had strong opinions about Kansas Springs that she shared freely, and a couple named the Gardners who had 3 children and a dog that had somehow gotten into the hall and was being covertly fed biscuits by the children while the adults looked the other way. Stephen Reed was there. She had known he would be, of course. He was standing with a group of men near the far wall when she came in, and he saw her when she entered, and he excused himself from his group in a way that was not hurried but was also not exactly slow, and he crossed the room to where she was standing with Martha Oakes and said, "Miss Brooks, you came. You suggested it had practical value," she said. "I did," he said, and the not-quite smile was there again, and Martha Oakes was watching them both with the transparent interest of a woman who did not bother concealing her observations. He danced with her, twice. The first time was the polka, which was lively and somewhat chaotic and left her breathless and laughing at the end of it in a way she had not laughed in a very long time, and he was laughing too, which did something significant to his face. The second time was a waltz, and she was aware of his hand at her waist and his other hand holding hers, and the way he kept a proper and respectful distance, and also the fact that proper and respectful distance was not, in the moment of a waltz in a lantern-lit hall in Kansas in the spring of 1882, as much distance as it sounded. On the wagon ride home under the enormous Kansas sky, with the stars out in their full and unreasonable abundance, she allowed herself to think about him in a way she had been declining to do for the past 10 days. She thought about the careful way he had written out the deed. She thought about the kitchen garden that someone had tended. She thought about the way he had said her name on that first day, as though the word itself was something worth paying attention to. And she thought about the waltz, which she was going to stop thinking about right now. She was still thinking about the waltz when she fell asleep. He came back to Willow Run 4 days later, this time with 2 of his hands in a wagon, and he said that he was passing by, and had noticed from the road that the north fence on the east pasture had come down in a section, and that he had brought posts and wire, and if she had no objection, he would be glad to repair it. She stood in the yard with her hands on her hips and looked at the wagon and then looked at him and said, "You could not possibly see that fence from the road." "The section is down," he maintained. "Stephen Reed," she said, and then stopped, because she had just used his first name without intending to, and they both noticed it at the same time, and the moment had a particular quality to it. "Harriet Brooks," he said quietly, with the kind of deliberateness that made it clear he intended the informality as well. She let his men fix the fence. She brought them all cold water from the well at midday, and she brought out cornbread she had baked that morning, and while the hands ate in the shade of the cottonwoods, she and Stephen Reed sat on the porch steps and ate and talked about nothing particularly consequential. The cattle market, the county road that needed grading, whether the weather would hold for the next week, and it was the most comfortable she had felt in years, which she recognized as a fact that required her attention. After his men had gone, Loading the wagon and heading back toward the Reed property, he lingered. He was standing at his horse's head, ready to go, but not going, and she was standing on the porch, and they were across the yard from each other, but it felt like a very small distance. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I want you to understand that I am not saying it to create any obligation or to make things difficult. I am saying it because I believe in being direct, and because I think you are the kind of person who would prefer directness to anything else." "I would," she said cautiously. He took a breath. "When your letter came," he said, "I read it 4 times, and then I read it again. And the thing that I kept coming back to was not the request, though the request was fair and I knew it was fair. It was the way you had written it, the precision of it, the lack of sentiment, but the way the feeling showed through despite that." He paused. "I had a picture of you before you rode up that lane. I had a picture of you from that letter. And when you came around the bend on that horse and sat up straight and looked down at me from the saddle and said my name like you were stating a fact rather than asking a question, the picture was right. And that is not a usual thing." Harriet had held very still through this. Now she said carefully, "What are you saying to me, Mr. Reed?" "I am saying," he said, "that I would like to call on you properly if you are willing. I am saying that I would like the opportunity to know you better. And I am saying this as plainly as I know how to say it so that there is no room for misunderstanding." The yard was very quiet. A meadowlark was singing somewhere in the east pasture, the long liquid song that Harriet associated with this specific piece of ground, because her father had called it the sound of the land being content. "I appreciate directness," she said at last, "and I do not want to be coy with you when you have been so honest with me." She held his gaze steadily. "I am willing. But I want you to know that I came back here for the land and for my father's memory, and I am not in the habit of depending on anyone, and any arrangement between us would need to account for that. I would not want it otherwise," he said simply. "A person who does not depend on anyone else is exactly the person whose company I would choose." She nodded once. "Then you may call on me," she said, "on Sunday if the weather is fair." It was fair. It was brilliant, in fact, the kind of May Sunday that Kansas offered occasionally as an apology for the rest of the year. And he arrived at 10 in the morning with a picnic basket that she suspected he had not packed himself, and which contained cold ham and bread, and a jar of preserved peaches that were the best preserved peaches she had ever eaten. And she ate 2 servings and did not apologize for it. They spread a blanket on the high grass on the northern rise of the property, where the view was best, and they talked for 3 hours. She learned that he was 29 years old, that he had grown up in Illinois, that he had 2 brothers both still in the East, that he had come west partly for the land, and partly because something in him had needed space in a way that the East could not provide. She told him about her mother, who had died when Harriet was 16, and about the way she had effectively run the household from that year forward, and about the school she had attended in Missouri that had a teacher who believed girls deserved the same education as boys, and how that teacher had changed the shape of what she believed was possible for herself. He listened to all of it with a seriousness that was not solemn. There was a warmth in it, a genuine curiosity, and he asked questions that showed he had heard what she said and wanted to understand it more fully. When she paused in the telling, he did not rush to fill the silence but let it sit there comfortably, like a person entirely at ease and quiet. "You are the most attentive listener I have ever spoken with," she told him, with some surprise in her own voice. "It is not a virtue," he said, with that almost smile. "It is simply that you say interesting things and I prefer listening to them over hearing myself talk." She laughed. The laugh surprised her by how naturally it came, and she saw in his face how much he liked the sound of it, and that made the world feel very particular and very good. Over the weeks that followed, he called on her every Sunday, and also on a few Wednesdays that were not officially planned but simply happened when he rode past on his way into Caldwell, and decided that this was in fact the direction his horse preferred to go. She began to look forward to the Wednesdays with a specific quality of anticipation that she recognized and did not try to suppress, because suppressing it had begun to feel like an unnecessary exercise in self-deprivation. She was busy in her own right. She had arranged to take in laundry from 2 families in Caldwell, which she did twice a week, and which brought in steady money. She had also begun sewing for Martha Oakes at the millinery, doing piecework that she could do in the evenings by candlelight when the outdoor work was done. The land itself was producing. The kitchen garden was lush and well beyond her own needs, so she boxed up the excess and sold it at the Saturday market in Caldwell, which surprised her neighbors and delighted her because her father had done the same thing, and she felt the gesture as a kind of continuity. She was building something, carefully and steadily, and she felt the satisfaction of it in her bones every evening when she sat on the porch and watched the creek and the long shadow of the cottonwoods moving east with the late sun. In June, Stephen brought her a horse. Not presented as a gift, which she would not have accepted, but explained as a loan. He had a mare he was not using, a 5-year-old bay named Acorn who was well-mannered and strong, and he thought Acorn would benefit from regular riding, and would Harriet be willing to exercise her? She saw exactly what he was doing, and she was moved by the care with which he had arranged it so that she could accept without feeling beholden, and she took Acorn gratefully, and rode her every morning along the creek, and felt herself become something she had not been in 2 years, which was someone who was not merely managing but was actually living. One evening in late June, he stayed later than was his custom. They had been talking on the porch about the county road meeting in Caldwell that she intended to attend to raise the matter of grading and maintenance, and the conversation had gone on because they were both interested in the topic and in each other, and the evening was warm and the creek was making its best sounds. And when he finally stood and said he should go, it was past 9 o'clock and the stars were very bright. He was at the porch steps and she was standing in the doorway, and he turned back to say something about the road meeting, and then he stopped saying it, and they were looking at each other in the starlight and the lamplight from the door, and Harriet had a very clear and unambiguous understanding of what was happening between them, the kind of understanding that bypasses the mind entirely and lives in the chest and in the hands and in the specific quality of silence. "Harriet," he said. "I know," she said. He came back up the 2 steps to the porch, and he stood very close, and he said, "I do not want to rush anything." "You are not rushing anything," she said. "We have been building toward this for 2 months at a pace that a glacier would find conservative." He laughed, and then she was laughing too, and then he took her hand carefully, as though the hand itself was something to be treated with the greatest respect, and he held it and looked at it for a moment, and she looked at their hands together and thought about the deed and the single silver dollar and the way this whole unlikely thing had started. "I am falling in love with you," he said. Simply, in the same direct way he had stated the intention to call on her, with the same lack of performance and the same complete sincerity. "I thought you should know." Her heart was doing something extraordinary. "I am aware," she said, "that this began in a very unusual way with a business transaction of remarkable eccentricity." $1, he said. $1, she agreed. "And you asked my name." She looked up at him. "I have been thinking about that, the way you asked it." "I needed to know it," he said. "Properly, something told me I was going to need to know it for a long time." She turned her hand in his so that their fingers interlaced, which was a thing she did deliberately and with full awareness of what it meant. "Stephen," she said, "I am also falling in love with you. I thought you should have that information." The smile that came to his face then was nothing like the small, careful, almost smile she had been collecting all these weeks. It was complete and unguarded, and it changed his face entirely into something that she thought she could look at for the rest of her life without growing tired of it. He did not kiss her that night. He pressed her hand and said good night with a formality that was entirely sincere and not even slightly old-fashioned, and he rode home in the dark with the stars above the Kansas grassland, and she watched his lantern disappear down the lane, and then sat on the porch for a very long time listening to the creek. July came with its full force. The heat was serious and the work was serious with it, but the land held, the kitchen garden producing abundantly, and she sold squash and tomatoes and beans at the Saturday market and bought herself, finally, for the first time in nearly 2 years, a length of pretty ribbon green, the color of the creek in early morning, and she wore it in her hair on Sunday and watched Stephen Reed's face when he arrived and saw it and said nothing, but looked at her with an expression that said everything. He had begun talking about the fall and the next year and the year after that, not with any urgency, but with the comfortable assumption of continuity that she recognized as something profound. He mentioned the county meeting as though she would be there. He said when talking about the road grading petition they were putting together for the county commissioner. She heard it every time, and every time it struck her as the most natural and also the most significant word in the language. One Sunday in late July, when the heat had broken slightly in the late afternoon, and there was a breeze off the grassland that was almost pleasant, she said to him, "I want to ask you something that I am asking out of curiosity rather than any particular urgency, so I would like you to receive it in that spirit." He looked at her with an expression of readiness. "All right." "What did you think you were going to do?" she asked. "When I rode up that lane, did you think you were going to sell that land back to me for $1? Was that already the plan?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the creek. "Not exactly," he said. "I knew I was going to give it back to you in some form. The dollar, I added that because I thought you would refuse a gift outright, and I wanted you to feel like it was a transaction, which it was in some respects, though not a financial one." He paused. "The asking your name, that was not planned. That was simply that you were standing there and you had just signed the deed, and I realized I had been calling you Miss Brooks in my head for weeks since your letter came, and I wanted to hear what your first name sounded like." "Harriet," she said, slightly dryly. "Harriet," he said, with the same care he had said it the first time, and her heart did its extraordinary thing again. She bought Acorn from him in August for a fair price that she insisted on and he eventually accepted, and the transfer of the mare's ownership felt like a small milestone, another thing set right and made properly hers. She now had the land, the horse, the growing business of her laundry and sewing and market sales, and a man who rode over from 8 miles east every Wednesday and every Sunday as reliably as the mail and considerably more welcome. On an August evening that was golden and still, sitting on the porch after supper, she had taken to feeding him supper on Sundays, which had not been planned but had simply become the way things were. He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and produced a small object and set it on the porch railing between them without saying anything. She looked at it. It was a ring. A simple ring, gold with a small inset stone that caught the evening light, and it was not extravagant and it was not small, and it was exactly the kind of thing she would have chosen herself if anyone had asked her, which no one had needed to because apparently he already knew. "I am going to ask you," he said, "in as straightforward a manner as I know how, because I think that is the manner you prefer, and also because this is not something I want to surround with too many words." He turned to look at her. "Harriet Brooks, I want to marry you. I want to spend my life adjacent to yours. I want to have breakfasts and suppers and arguments and long silences and all the days in between with you. I'm not asking you to change anything about how you live or who you are, because what you are is exactly what I want to be near. I'm asking you to let me add myself to it if you are willing." Harriet looked at the ring on the porch railing. She looked at Stephen Reed, who was watching her with the steady dark eyes and the complete earnestness that had been undoing her careful defenses since that first morning on this porch. "You are the most straightforward man I have ever met," she said. "Is that a problem?" He asked. "It is the farthest thing from a problem," she said. "Yes, my answer is yes." He put the ring on her finger there on the porch of her father's house, while the creek murmured in the cottonwood dark, and the meadowlark sang its last song of the evening from somewhere in the east pasture, And then he kissed her for the first time, which was also the most natural thing that had ever happened and the most extraordinary. And she was aware of his hand at her jaw and of the evening air, and of the Kansas sky going deep blue above the trees, and of her father's land surrounding them on all four sides like something that was watching and approving. They were married in October in the Caldwell church, which was small and whitewashed and smelled of old wood and beeswax, and the ceremony was performed by the minister, Reverend Cole, who had a good speaking voice and a tendency to look profoundly moved by the proceedings even at the most routine weddings, and who was on this occasion, Harriet thought privately, looking somewhat more moved than usual. Martha Oakes made her dress, which was ivory wool with small pearl buttons, and a collar edged in delicate white embroidery that Harriet had done herself in the evenings by candlelight, and which was the finest piece of clothing she had owned since before the difficult years. The Hartley family came, and the Gardners with their 3 children and their dog who had somehow gotten himself invited again, and several of Stephen's hands and their wives, and a good portion of Caldwell besides, because a wedding between 2 well-liked people in a small community is not an event that gets declined. Stephen Reed, standing at the front of the church in his good black coat with his hat in his hands, and his dark eyes finding hers the moment she appeared in the doorway, looked like a man who had arrived precisely where he intended to be. She walked toward him steadily, and with her chin up and her eyes clear and the green ribbon in her hair, and she thought that her father would have liked him enormously. This honest and straightforward man who had given away land worth hundreds of dollars for a single coin, and a name spoken in an afternoon kitchen over bad coffee. After the ceremony, out in the churchyard in the bright October sun while people ate from the tables the women had set up along the fence, Martha Oakes took hold of Harriet's hands and said, "How exactly did this happen? The last I knew you had come to buy back some land." "I did buy it back," Harriet said, "for $1. Martha looked at Stephen, who was standing a short distance away talking to the Hartley brothers with the particular expression of a man who was happy and slightly overwhelmed by being the center of a social occasion. "And the man who sold it to you for $1 just happened to—" "Yes," said Harriet. Martha Oakes laughed. "Well," she said, "that is the best purchase in the history of Kansas, and I include the entire cattle industry." They settled into the rhythm of married life, with a naturalness that Harriet had not anticipated feeling, because she had been independent for long enough that she had assumed the addition of another person would require considerable adjustment. What she found instead was that Stephen Reed's presence in her days added to rather than subtracted from the particular contentment she had built for herself on the Willow Run land. He was not a man who needed managing or supervising or interpreting. He was a man who showed up and did the thing, and was honest about what he thought and curious about what she thought, and who could sit with her in companionable quiet without needing the silence filled. He rode over from his property every morning to have breakfast with her, and they worked together on both operations, splitting the day between his cattle and her kitchen garden and market sales, and the ongoing management of the 60 acres that was becoming, under their combined attention, more productive every season. The north fence Stephen had invented an excuse to fix was replaced properly in November. The chimney was pointed before the cold set in. The cracked window got a new pane of good glass. One by one, the small deficiencies that had accumulated during the years when the land had belonged to someone who did not love it were remedied, and the house and the property began to feel more fully itself again. She had a letter from Gerald Purvis in December, which she did not open for 2 days because she was not certain she had sufficient goodwill in reserve to deal with what it might contain. When she finally opened it, it turned out to be neither an apology nor a demand but simply a business circular, the kind he sent to everyone in the county, advertising the terms of his lending operation. She burned it in the kitchen stove and found the burning of it a satisfying conclusion to that particular chapter of things. Stephen's cattle operation expanded in the spring of 1883 when he purchased another 200 acres to the northeast and hired 2 additional hands. She was involved in this decision. He asked her view on the purchase and listened to it carefully and incorporated it into his thinking, which was so different from what she had observed of most men and their wives' involvement in business decisions, that she occasionally still felt the small shock of it. She had views on the cattle market and on land prices and on the wisdom of various timing decisions, and he treated those views as information rather than interference, which was how she had always believed she should be treated by the person she shared her life with. That spring she also discovered she was expecting their first child, which she told him on a Tuesday morning in April while they were drinking coffee in the kitchen, simply and directly, in the manner of a woman who had decided that the news was good and should be delivered as such. He put down his coffee cup very carefully. And then he came around the table and took her face in both hands and looked at her with an expression so full and unguarded that she felt it in the bones of her chest, and he said, "Harriet, this is the best morning I have had in my entire life." "It is a fairly good morning," she agreed. He laughed and pulled her close and held her, and she put her arms around him and felt the solidity of him and the warmth of the kitchen and the sound of the creek outside, and thought that her father had been exactly right about what mattered most in this world, and that she had found it, in a way that he would have found satisfying in its particular logic, through persistence and honesty and a single silver dollar. The baby came in November. A boy, red-faced and emphatic about his opinions from the first minute, who arrived on a cold, clear morning when the frost was on the grass, and the creek was running low, and the sky was the hard, bright blue of a Kansas winter. Harriet had insisted on Reverend Cole being summoned only after the fact, because she had also insisted on the company of Martha Oakes and the neighboring Mrs. Hartley during the birth, and she trusted them considerably more than she trusted the minister for this particular purpose. She lay in the bed of her father's house with the boy in her arms, and Stephen sat on the edge of the bed with his hand over hers and his eyes bright in a way that men in this territory generally did not permit themselves, but which she had come to understand was simply Stephen Reed without his exterior maintained, and she said, "I want to name him Elijah." He said immediately, "Yes, of course, Elijah Reed." He tested the sound of it. "Elijah Brooks Reed." "Yes," she said, "that, exactly." Elijah Brooks Reed turned out to have emphatic opinions about most things and a laugh that arrived early and stayed constant, and he had his father's steady dark eyes and what Harriet suspected was her own stubborn streak, which she considered a reasonable inheritance. Stephen moved permanently to the Willow Run property when Elijah was 3 months old, because 8 miles had become an impractical distance for a man with a wife and a child. He wanted to see every morning and every evening and frequently in between. He kept the Reed Cattle Co. operating under the management of his most trusted hand, a quiet and capable man named Birch who had been with him since the beginning, and he divided his attention between the 2 operations with the same organized competence he brought to everything. The house felt different with all 3 of them in it. Fuller. There were small boots by the door that were very small indeed, and there was the perpetual need for warm water on the stove, and there were evenings that ended earlier than they used to because the baby needed tending, and then once the baby was settled they were both tired and it was easier to sit together on the porch for a short time in the dark and then come in and sleep, which was a different kind of life from before and was also, she had decided, the best kind. In the spring of 1884, Harriet expanded her market garden operation significantly. She had observed over 2 seasons which crops the Caldwell market wanted most and at what prices, and she had developed relationships with 3 restaurants in town and a hotel that were willing to buy direct. She hired a girl from the Hartley family to help with the planting and tending, which freed her to focus on the sales side of the business. And by July, She was running what was genuinely a small commercial operation that was paying her well above the laundry and sewing income she had started with. Stephen was proud of this without being condescending about it, which was the correct way to be proud, and he said so directly on the evening she told him the summer earnings figures, which she had written in a small ledger she kept in the kitchen drawer. "You have built something real," he said. "From nothing in 2 years." "Not from nothing," she said. "From 60 acres and $1. And a considerable amount of work," he said. "The work was always there to be done," she said. "I simply did it." He looked at her across the kitchen table in the lamplight with an expression of such open and uncomplicated love that she set down her ledger and reached across the table and took his hand. And they sat there for a while in the kitchen of her father's house, with the creek running outside and the baby sleeping in the next room, and the Kansas night doing its enormous and beautiful work beyond the windows. A second child came in the autumn of 1885. A girl this time, who arrived with less drama than Elijah and more determination, settling herself immediately and quietly into the life of the household, as though she had simply been waiting for her appropriate moment to appear. They named her Clara, after a great-aunt of Stephen's who had been, by his account, a woman of formidable practicality and excellent judgment, which seemed like the right kind of character to name a daughter for. Clara was a serious child who watched the world with a focused attention that Harriet recognized. She sat in the kitchen garden and observed the insects moving through the bean flowers with the patient interest of a scientist. She sat in the barn with her father and watched him work the cattle with the same quality of attention. She was, Harriet thought, the kind of person who was going to pay very close attention to this world and figure out what it owed her, which was an approach Harriet wholeheartedly approved. By 1886, the Brooks place, which everyone in the county had taken to calling by its original name again, because names root themselves in the people who love a place and do not easily dislodge, had become something that Harriet's father would have recognized and rejoiced at. The kitchen garden was a substantial operation. The house had a new addition on the west side, 2 more rooms that Stephen and Birch had built in the summer, with good windows and a proper floor. The fence lines were all straight and maintained. The creek bank had been reinforced in the low section where the spring melt had a habit of eating at the earth, and there were young cottonwood trees planted where the old ones had come down in the ice storm 2 winters past. The 60 acres was producing consistently, and so was the Reed Cattle Co. property to the east, which Birch ran with quiet efficiency and which was healthy and growing. They had found, without planning it, a way of managing 2 complementary operations that made good use of both the land and the water and the seasonal rhythms of this particular piece of Kansas. And the financial result was a stability and modest prosperity that both of them had worked too hard and too long for and appreciated accordingly. One evening in October of 1886, 4 years from the morning, she had ridden up this lane with $43 and a prayer. Harriet stood on the porch in the last of the autumn light and looked out at the land. The cottonwoods along Willow Run were going gold, and the east pasture was the tawny brown of late grass, and the kitchen garden had been put to bed for the season and covered with the good compost she had been building all summer. Elijah was in the yard with one of the dogs, engaged in some project that involved a great deal of mud and apparent satisfaction. Clara was on the porch step beside her mother, looking at the same view with her focused child's attention. "What are you looking at?" Clara asked. "The land," Harriet said. "Our land," Clara said, with the simple confidence of a child who had never known it to be otherwise. "Yes," Harriet said, "our land." Stephen came out of the barn and crossed the yard and stopped to ruffle Elijah's hair in passing, which Elijah tolerated with the particular dignity of a nearly 4-year-old, and then he came to the porch and stood beside Harriet and looked at the same view. "Beautiful evening," he said. "Yes," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him slightly, not for support, because she did not need support, but for the pleasure of it, The warmth of his arm and the warmth of the autumn evening and the warmth of the life they had built here together on this ground. And Clara looked up at both of them with her serious face, and then looked back at the land with what appeared to be approval of the general arrangement. There was a thing that Harriet had not allowed herself to think about for years, and had only recently, in the security of these days, been able to approach. It was the fact that she had been afraid for a long time. Not of specific things. She was not given to specific fears, and never had been, but of the larger and more diffuse fear that had lived inside the years of hard work and solitude and uncertain finances. The fear that the world was essentially indifferent to the people who deserved better from it. That effort and honesty and endurance were not sufficient protection against the particular cruelties that a difficult era visited on a person without a safety net. She had been afraid, and she had not let herself know she was afraid, because there had been work to do, and the work had been a better companion than fear in any case. But she knew it now, looking back from the other side of it, and she knew also what had changed it. A man who sold land for $1 and asked her name. A man who had planted her kitchen garden and mended her fence line, and arrived every Wednesday morning as reliably as the sunrise with his hat in his hands and his honest face and his genuine attention, and who had never once in 4 years asked her to be less than exactly what she was. "Stephen," she said. He said, looking at the cottonwoods. "I want to tell you something." He turned to look at her, and his face in the autumn light was the face she had been looking at for 4 years and learning more of every day. "I did not come here to fall in love," she said. "I came here to get back what was ours, and I did get it back. But I got considerably more besides, and I am aware of that, and I think about it a great deal. I think about the particular odds of it, and about the fact that if Purvis had not sold the land to you specifically, or if you had been a different kind of man, and most men in this territory who had what you had would have been a different kind of man, none of this would be here." He listened to all of this with his usual quality of attention, and then he said, "I think about it too. I think about the letter coming, and reading it and feeling that I already knew something important about the person who had written it. And I think about you coming around that bend in the lane on that horse with your back straight, and your chin up, and a look on your face that said you intended to get exactly what you had come for, which you did." He paused. "You always were going to get what you came for, Harriet. I just got to be part of what that turned out to be." She looked up at him, and she thought about the meadowlark in the east pasture and the creek in the cottonwood dark and the ring that had sat on the porch railing in the October evening light, and about $1 and a name said twice in an afternoon kitchen. "Yes," she said softly, "you did." He kissed her there on the porch with Clara on the step below them, paying close attention to something in the grass, and Elijah making a declaration about the dog in the yard. And the Kansas sky went from gold to orange to the deep clear blue of a fall evening, and the creek said its steady thing to the cottonwoods, and the meadowlark, still there, always there, called once from the east pasture before settling in for the night. The years that followed built on one another like the cottonwood rings, each one adding something: another season of good harvest, another successful cattle drive, another child. Their third came in 1888, another boy whom they named James after Stephen's father, and who turned out to be the most good-natured of the three, approaching the world with a cheerfulness that was entirely its own thing, and that made the house a particular kind of bright. Clara at 3 became Clara at 4 became Clara at 5, her serious attention growing more articulate and directed, spending long hours with Harriet in the garden learning the names of every plant and the logic of every rotation, asking questions that showed she was going to be, in her own way, as good at making things grow as her mother was. Elijah, at 6 and 7, began to understand what the land was in the way that children who grow up on a specific piece of ground come to understand it, not as property or asset, but as a place that has a personality, that responds to certain treatments and resists others, that is in some fundamental way alive and specific. He had his mother's way with it and his father's patience, and Harriet watched him crouch in the kitchen garden and pull a weed with careful exactness, and felt something large and good move through her. In 1889, the land run opened the unassigned lands in Oklahoma Territory, and half of Kansas seemed to pack up and ride south overnight, drawn by the possibility of free land and fresh starts. Harriet and Stephen watched their neighbors debate it, and some of them go, and discussed it together in the evenings, and came to the same conclusion without difficulty. They were not going anywhere. They had what they had worked for. The Willow Run land was not a starting point, something to leave when something better appeared. It was the thing itself. It was home. The county road was eventually graded in 1890, due in no small part to the sustained effort of the petition that Harriet had organized, revised, organized again, taken to the county commissioner 3 times in person, and finally succeeded with on the 3rd visit, which had required her to explain the logical case for road maintenance with such patient thoroughness that the commissioner had ultimately agreed simply to end the conversation. Stephen had been present at the 3rd meeting and afterward had told her with complete sincerity that she was the most effective person he had ever seen operate in a county meeting, and she had accepted this as the genuine compliment it was. Martha Oakes married a hardware merchant from Wichita in 1890 and moved east, which Harriet found sad in the specific way that the departure of good friends is sad, and she wrote Martha long letters that received long letters back, full of news and opinion, and the particular kind of friendship that does not require proximity to maintain itself. The Hartley family grew, and their oldest daughter, Anna, took over some of Harriet's laundry work when Harriet decided, in 1891, that the market garden was large enough and productive enough to require all of her time and attention, and she needed to stop dividing herself. That was the year also that Stephen sat her down at the kitchen table with a cup of good coffee and said, with his characteristic directness, that he had been thinking about expanding the cattle operation further, southward toward the Strip, but that the capital required was significant and it would mean a lean year for both properties, and he wanted to talk through whether she thought it was the right moment. She looked at his ledgers and her ledgers and the land prices he had noted and the cattle market projections for the next 3 years, and she said, after thinking about it for 2 days, that she thought the moment was right, but that the southward expansion specifically was not the best direction, that the land to the east of his current holding was better quality and available at a similar price, and that she had spoken to the Oaks property widow who was considering selling and who might be persuaded to a fair price if approached respectfully. He listened to this. He acted on it. The expansion went east, not south, and it was a good decision, which they both knew and which he acknowledged plainly, and with the lack of ego that she had always found one of his most essential qualities. The summer of 1892 gave them a drought week in July that threatened the garden and worried both of them, and Harriet hauled water from the creek twice a day for 9 days to keep the critical crops alive, and Stephen rigged a better system for pulling water from the creek using a gravity channel that he and Birch built in 2 days, which saved the tomatoes and the beans, and required a full summer's replanting of the squash. They sat on the porch in the August evening after the crisis had passed and the rains had come back, and they were tired in the bone-deep way of people who have worked through a difficulty and survived it, and she said to him, "I keep thinking about that first drought year, the one that took my father." "I know," he said. "We held it," she said. "We held it," he agreed. And he took her hand, and they sat there with the sound of the rainful creek, and the stars coming out above the wet grass, and the night was large and good around them. Elijah Brooks Reed in his 10th year was tall for his age and serious about the land in the way that Harriet had hoped, and a little wild about everything else in the way that was inevitable for a boy in that country and that time, given to riding Acorn, now older and wise, and entirely suited to the work of educating a child, too fast across the east pasture in the late afternoons, when he thought no one was watching. Harriet was always watching, or at least aware, but she had decided some years back that a certain amount of fast riding was a reasonable part of growing up in Kansas, and that her energy was better spent on things that could actually hurt him than on things that were simply exciting. Clara at 9 was already keeping a journal of the garden in her own neat hand, recording what had been planted where and on what date, and what the results had been, with small drawings of the plants at various stages that showed she had inherited something of her mother's precise eye. Harriet found this journal once in Clara's room and read it with a feeling so large and specific that she had to sit down on the edge of the bed and simply sit with it for a moment. Her daughter was learning the land. Her daughter was writing it down. The continuity of it went from her father to her, and forward through this child with her serious face and her careful writing. And it was everything her father had meant when he had stood on this porch and talked about what it meant to have ground you could call your own. James, at 4, was primarily interested in the dogs and in the matter of what his siblings were doing that he was not yet allowed to do, which was most things. But he pursued these interests with a persistence and good cheer that suggested he would eventually achieve most of his ambitions and be cheerful about the ones he did not. In the fall of 1892, Harriet and Stephen sat down and did the full accounting, the land, both properties now running together as a single managed operation. The garden business, the cattle, and the numbers were good. They were more than good. They were the kind of numbers that her father had worked his entire life toward and never reached, and they had reached them in 10 years together on the same ground. Stephen looked at the numbers for a long time and then looked up at her. "Your father built something here," he said. "You finished it." "We finished it," she said. He nodded. "We finished it." She thought of the $43 in her pocket and the prayer folded inside her coat. She thought of the gold light on the dust of Main Street that first morning in Caldwell, and the sun cutting low and hard across the flatlands. She thought of riding down this lane the first time, seeing the kitchen garden that someone had planted for her before she even arrived, and understanding in that moment that the man who had planted it was not the man she had imagined. She thought of $1 and a name spoken twice in an afternoon kitchen, the second time carefully, as though it was something worth keeping. She looked at Stephen Reed across the kitchen table in the lamplight of her father's house, and she was 26 years old again for just a moment, arriving on a horse with her back straight and her chin up. And she was also 36 years old with 3 children sleeping down the hall, and a husband she loved with a depth and steadiness that had only grown larger and more rooted with every year. And she was both of these women at once, and she was on her father's land, and it was hers, and it was her children's, and it was the most right thing she had ever known. "I love you," she said, "very much, in case there is any confusion on the matter." "There is no confusion on the matter," he said, with the complete smile, the unguarded one that she had been collecting for 10 years and that still struck her as the finest thing she had ever been given to look at. "I love you very much as well, Harriet Brooks Reed, in case you had forgotten." "I have not forgotten," she said. "I do not intend to." Outside, the October wind was moving through the cottonwoods along Willow Run, and the creek was running clear and full with the autumn water, the way it should run, the way her father had needed it to run in that drought year when everything had gone wrong. And the east pasture was going gold in the fading light, and the kitchen garden was covered and sleeping and dreaming of spring, and somewhere in the grass the meadowlark had gone quiet for the night, and the 3 children were breathing in the quiet rooms down the hall, and the Kansas sky above all of it was vast and dark and starred in its absolute entirety. The Willow Run land held all of this and kept it, the way good land keeps everything that has been lived on it, the grief and the labor and the persistence and the love. And the deed that Harriet had filed with Corwin at the Caldwell Land Office on the 4th day of May in 1882 said 60 acres and $1 silver received in full, and it was true, and it would remain true, and the name on it was hers. It had always been going to be hers. She had simply needed to come back for it. And in coming back for it, she had found everything else besides.